we're going to get started now. Most people can just jump in and join whenever they want to. First of all, welcome and thank you very much for registering for this OBS webinar today. It's the first of a two-part series on building a scalable enterprise records management strategy for the SharePoint platform. I split this up into two parts because there certainly is a lot to talk about from both a practical and technical perspective. And I really wanted to use the first part to really set the foundation. I know there's a lot of us out there and certainly a lot of people that have registered that will have varying degrees of experience with records management systems as well with SharePoint. You're probably also in different stages of your records management implementations, and I really wanted to use this first part to really get across a few key concepts that will hopefully, well, they will certainly lead into the part 2 series, which I will announce at the end of this webinar. So part 2 is really going to focus on more the hands-on live demonstration and more of the technical elements, and as I said, I'll provide you those details as we go through the end of this presentation. For those who haven't used the GoToWebinar functionality before, please feel free to ask questions. I will leave all the questions right the way till the end. We have an hour. I've timed it to hopefully finish within about 40 minutes. That will leave us about 20 to 15 minutes or so at the end for questions. So please put your questions on the forum and we'll answer them right at the end. Okay, so the first thing I thought is a little bit about the presenter today. Some of you would have seen my picture on when you registered the webinar, but my name is Desmond Russell. I have over 15 years experience in the information management industry, and when I talk about information management, I'm really talking about all the disciplines of information management, right the way including web content management, knowledge management, and records management is one of those disciplines. I lead the National OBS Information Management practice, and this practice has a strong representation across all the states of Australia, and I certainly consider myself a subject matter expert in all things records management. So if we look at the records management industry over the past decade, we certainly have seen quite a big consolidation across the multiple types of products that are out there. And those are the products that have traditionally occupied the space. In my opinion, this has been largely driven by the convergence of the technologies that surround information management, the things like content management, web content management, workflow, knowledge management, etc. And as we've seen the convergence of these types of technologies, we've certainly seen an accelerated adoption of these technologies across the enterprise. Within the records management industry, what we found difficult to understand is just how these technologies relate to records management systems and the effect that these have on our overall records management strategy. We also continue to adopt the same traditional approaches to how we implement records management systems. And we really land up competing with these types of technologies, and we further push records management towards the back office. So this becomes even more relevant when we look at the SharePoint platform and all the different workloads that are available on the platform. We have to recognize that in order to succeed, our approach and our methods really, they have to change. So in terms of what needs to change in our approach of developing our records management strategy, there are 6 key areas that we need to consider changing in our approach. Firstly, a record is not a type of information, but a technical characteristic that really represents the state of an information. End users don't make a distinction between looking for a record or looking for a non-record. To them, all the information that they're looking for is part of their business decision making, and they don't make any sort of distinction. Metadata serves a particular purpose, and usually its purpose is linked to a particular audience that is interested in that information. There's certainly no need to burden users with irrelevant metadata. Traditionally, we have approached the implementation of records controls within a separate repository from where information was really created. So we forced users to create documents or information in one particular place and then move them, or we moved them to another place, which was very much a different structure that they had to deal with. We need to be able to separate where users work from where we manage our records. In the past, we've also relied heavily on training of users in records management disciplines, really to ensure that we can apply records management controls at the point of creating this information. We really need to look more at the use of technology to assign these controls in a much more automated manner. We need to remove also the differentiation between records and other types of information. We need to treat all information the same. We also then need to look at ways in which we can systematically control how information or records are created in our system. And lastly, one of the most important areas is around records management, or the fable of records management leading to better information management. Essentially, it's the other way around. It's information management enables better records management. So before we continue, we want to have a look at some of the key building blocks of our records management strategy. And these are building blocks that are really aligned to a SharePoint platform, but certainly aligned to how we need to think and the methods we need to, or the methodology we need to go through in order to work through building our records management strategy. So the first component of building our records management strategy is understanding where we are creating our information. If we are still a file share-based organization, then we really need to first tackle what we call document management. Within the SharePoint context, document management is part of the platform. We get document management purely by making use of certain SharePoint functionality. So when someone says we're delivering document management, really, you've already bought document management as part of SharePoint. What we're doing is we're looking for ways to support where users work on a day-to-day basis. So often organizations will when we're talking to organizations, they'll talk about we need to implement records management, and often the document management component is very much not even part of the discussion then. So we really need to, if you're looking at your strategies at the moment, particularly in SharePoint, and you're not doing document management, or SharePoint is not the central place for you to store your information on a day-to-day basis, well, we really need to take a few steps back and start to identify what that document management system is actually going to look like. We will look at the relationship between information architecture and document management later on in this presentation. But in terms of document management, the structure of document management is really irrelevant from the records management domain. The document management structure is a structure that is really controlled by how users want to work. So we would traditionally view this as, well, what does a file share structure look like? Yes, there is a file share type structure that certain users like to work with, but there are also other structures that users are very, very familiar with, and a lot of that is driven by technologies as search and metadata technologies. Secondly, we need to look at implementing a set of control terminology to support the consistent labeling of information that will look to aid identification, search, and retrieval, and also classify information. This control terminology we usually refer in the records management sense to the business classification scheme, or the business taxonomy, or a thesaurus. From a records management strategy, this does not particularly relate to using traditional forms of classification, whether these are functional classification schemes or functional and organizational classification schemes. Organizations today don't particularly have one type of classification scheme that marries across the organization. So what we need to do is we certainly need to identify what those classification mechanisms are in the business, and then we need to adequately prepare for that in the design. Linked to how we manage the terminology and naming of information is looking to build up an organizational metadata model where we need to manage the distribution and sharing of metadata, policies, document templates, etc. right across our solution. Having a central place to manage this is critical because the central place enables us to easily articulate any changes and push those changes out into the system. From a SharePoint perspective, we look to utilize the SharePoint functionality known as the Enterprise Content Hub. The Enterprise Content Hub is a piece of functionality in SharePoint that allows us to centrally store and manage this type of metadata information, but then control how it's published and shared across the organization. It provides the central control, and it also provides us a way to update and manage changes that occur to things like metadata, document types, or information policies. In implementing the records management controls within the context of where information is created, going back to my further slide around how do we remove the need for end users with these records management controls and apply these controls, we need a set of business rules that determine what should occur in the event of a record being created. These business rules are dynamic. These business rules are defined once and they apply to records no matter where they are created in the system. Now if you have a look at that picture in front of you, you typically see the document management area on the left-hand side being something that could look quite unstructured in terms of a records management sense. And that is deliberate. It is deliberate because that is where we want users to work. We want users to work within a familiar environment and an environment that works for them. The records classification rules, or the business rules, really are the glue between identifying the types of documents that are created in the system and associating a particular records class or records classification rule to that. Now the traditional forms of this type of classification have really been driven around an end user performing a particular action. In building an enterprise records management strategy, we look to disband these traditional forms of end users performing these actions, and we really look to focus a lot more on using systematic controls in how this is actually implemented. And that could be defined as controls of having a policy that sweeps through the system that automatically identifies certain content based on its metadata and pushes that content to the records management system. Alternatively, not all our information may be records, so we certainly look to implement some some classification rules around temporary records. So those are records, or that is information that is considered to be managed in a temporary basis, not key or core to the organization's overall business, and we can certainly apply policies to that information as well. An important point around the records classification rules, or the business rules, is that we want to ensure that we could consistently treat information the same. These rules apply to all content or all information created in the system, and they are dynamic in the sense that each of the rules, each time a new piece of content is actually added to the system, the records classification rules will actually inspect that content and apply the specific rules for that type of content in the system. Lastly, we look at a central place to manage our records in the system. As I mentioned before in one of the themes that we're talking about, and that is separating where records are, or information is created, from where records are managed. And we typically use what we call a file plan to be able to manage these records centrally. So the process works as such, and a piece of information is created in our document management space or document management work area. An information policy or a business rule is run on that information on a timely basis, and depending on the type of information it is then interpreted by the classification rules engine and assigned to a particular area of our organizational file plan. Now, the file plan itself is very much synonymous to the records management space, in that it's a very structured and a very hierarchical way of grouping and aggregating our information. The records file plan is also a way in which information, or should I say records, is immediately assigned particular records management controls, such as a retention and disposal policy, a particular security category, or even additional metadata in the sense of what type of disposal policy covers this record category. All of this, in terms of this records management strategy, the goal that we are trying to achieve is that we provide end users with a familiar environment that they can work in, which is really focused on them doing their job and ease of use. End users require no formal training in records management, and we start to use automated information and system policies to actually get this Hi everyone, sorry, I seem to have lost audio control for a few moments there, so I will just back up in terms of what I was and recapping on this particular slide. Could anyone please post a question just to say that they can hear me? Okay, great. I've got confirmation that people can hear me now. Okay, so as I was stating around this final in this particular slide here, that we're trying to really focus on two key stakeholders in the system, and that is our end user and the records manager. And by separating these worlds in our records management strategy, we really are able to provide each particular stakeholder with a system that is, in a records management system, that meets their needs. I think we're trying to divorce the need for an end user to certainly be involved formally in the records management process. But more importantly for the records manager, we are certainly providing a central place for where information should be, or records should be managed, and where compliance can take effect. As I discussed earlier, there are some key SharePoint technical elements that we will talk to now. The success of the records management strategy really depends on us looking at these technical elements. Now, I suppose a lot of us who are new to the SharePoint industry or the SharePoint technology platform will certainly find some of these concepts are quite different. But as I said in the beginning of this presentation, I really want to get these key concepts together and formalized in part one of this presentation, so we can certainly in part two all come at it from what I call maybe a level playing field. So these SharePoint technical elements are key to the success of our overall records management strategy, and I'm going to talk about each one of these particular areas. Information architecture. So information architecture in a SharePoint context is certainly something that is really relevant, particularly for a document and records management implementation. Traditionally in the SharePoint space, information architecture has really been pushed to the traditional intranet type environment where organizations are trying to establish an information architecture for how they will implement their organizational intranet. But as we start to work with documents and records in the SharePoint platform, we need to have a multidisciplined information architecture. So some of you who are working with SharePoint purely as an intranet environment, what we really need to do is we really need to step back and have a look at these various aspects of information architecture. Now, information architecture is really the cornerstone of supporting our overall information management and enterprise records management strategy in SharePoint. There are three key areas. The first area is what we call the navigational taxonomy. The second area is the operational taxonomy, and the third area is the business taxonomy. The navigational taxonomy is about understanding pathways to information or how information is presented to the user. Now, a navigational taxonomy is not something that is always set down in stone, and it's certainly something that is subject to change. So if you were approaching, or if you could visualize for me having a look at a intranet or internet page or a web page, there's always a bunch of tabs that allow us to navigate the system or navigate the site. Those tags can really change, although that structure can really change. But the underlying information or where information lives doesn't change. So we can certainly use the navigational taxonomy to deliver a information presentation layer that is really independent of where information actually lives. This is the first dimension in our information architecture layer. The second dimension is what we call the operational taxonomy. Now the operational taxonomy is really geared around where information content is placed. So operational taxonomy, align that to your thinking around where someone would go to place a document in the system. We call this operational because this supports the day-to-day process of an end user taking a piece of information and placing it in the system. In a traditional records management sense, we would look to understand how users work with their information and where they want information to be structured in the system. A lot of the time, this approach really led us to taking how a user worked in a particular department and aligning how that department works or how that information would be classified in a very structured classification scheme. An operational taxonomy does not bring in business classification or records classification terminology. This is purely how end users want to work and how end users want to see their information. Now, through an organization's information architecture, we certainly will get common patterns. And when I talk about patterns, these are patterns of how information is represented in the operational area. So, for instance, we might have cross-functional areas like finance, HR, etc. And we can identify a pattern for how managers will keep their employee information and how managers will keep their budget and finance information. When we understand these patterns, we can look to implement these patterns within our information architecture. What this starts to drive then is some consistency in how information is stored across the system. Obviously, within the operational taxonomy, we look to define other elements of the information architecture, and that would be things like information security and information access. The last cornerstone of our information architecture is what we call the business taxonomy. The business taxonomy is really geared around bringing in this records management domain of classifying information into our overall SharePoint strategy domain. And that is how we control the description or labeling of content independent of its location. So what we're doing here is we're bringing the discipline of classification in records management, and that is that I will consistently classify information based on its based on the context of that particular piece of information. And we're bringing this into the SharePoint space because there are certainly disciplines around information classification that are very advantageous and need to be brought into our overall records management strategy. So the business taxonomy then controls where information or how information is classified, but it really does not depend or tie itself to where information is stored in our operational area. So I could have an operational area or multiple operational areas that store HR information. However, my business taxonomy will be consistent in how information or how classification occurs with that HR information. The next area I wanted to talk about as part of our key technical element is what we call metadata. So metadata is common to everyone that's on the call today, and I wanted to bring a way in which we look to identify metadata in our overall enterprise records management strategy. In the past, we used to look at metadata for records management purely to support the records management process or the management of records, and that is to provide that description. We then got a little bit more savvy about this, and I understood that metadata could certainly provide a lot of value to end users and would certainly support things like search and providing additional descriptive information to it. So what we look to do is, again, approach metadata in a three-pronged sort of approach. And that is that there will be an element of organizational metadata, there will be an element of business process metadata, and there will be an element of personalized metadata. And I'm going to talk through each one of these elements now. So organizational metadata is really what we refer to as controlled metadata. This is common metadata that we would like and we need to be assigned to all documents or all information within the system, no matter what type of information it is. And usually this metadata would be a construct of what users would add or what records managers would add and what the system itself would provide. So some of the organizational type metadata might be things like a classification scheme or a organizational thesaurus. System metadata would typically be around things like version number, the version ID, who created it, and the date created. Those are all systematic metadata elements. The next level of metadata that we need to consider is business process. This refers to specifically supporting a business task within a particular process. So for instance, if we had a type of information that surrounded a board reporting activity or board reporting piece of information in the organization, that there would be an element of organizational metadata that might be a consistent labeling of or classification of that information, and it might be something like strategic management reporting. However, the business process metadata is really looking to capture things like what board month we are reporting on or what particular board we are reporting with. And we have to have a look at, we have to bring in business process metadata to clearly show that, or to clearly enable end users to be able to actually use this information in a way that they need to use it. The last element of looking at metadata in our technical, in the design of our enterprise strategy, is really around what we call personalized metadata. Now, personalized metadata is more a element of bringing in some of the Web 2.0 features around things like taxonomy features, and that is around users being able to tag or add information that represent their own terms and their own labels to really give it a personal factor. So when we look at metadata in our strategy, we really need to focus on these core three elements here. The next element in our strategy is our file plan. So our file plan will support the aggregation of records within a central location. So we want to provide a hierarchical structure in which these records can be aggregated and stored. And really the structure is really, or where records live, is really dependent on the records classification or the records metadata that has been assigned to them. The file plan also gives us an immediate way in which we can link certain records controls to the organization's classification scheme, such as retention and disposal, security classification, or additional elements of records management metadata. And then the last element is about distributing records management or records across multiple repositories to support lifecycle and disaster recovery. So we might have traditional repositories that have or that retain information of short-term value, and our long-term value records need to be shifted to a more resource-intensive, disaster recovery focused repository, and the file plan structure allows us to do that. The last element of our records management strategy is really looking at treating information within a life cycle, or treating records within the life cycle. And that is that all information in the system will go through some form of a life cycle. Treating information within a life cycle will ensure consistency in how we treat like information. So independent of where that information is created, independent of who creates that information, we will treat it the same. Information is managed from creation to disposition. So the fact that we are capturing information in a document management sense and information is not a record still means and still entails that we will control how that information is managed right the way until it is disposed. Retention for all information in every state of its life cycle. Often we seem to, in a records management sense, always think about it's the record that we want to maintain. However, in an information management sense, there's information that gets created in draft format. It's information that gets created that doesn't actually become a record. And to support a broader information management strategy of consistently refining the information and making information relevant to users, we need to ensure that this temporary or work in progress information also becomes part of the information lifecycle. With the information lifecycle, records controls are placed within the context of where information is created. So by understanding the information lifecycle, we can start to align our records management controls within that context. An example here is that information gets created in a human resource area of the organization, and understanding human resource has a particular type of records controls that need to be assigned to it. We can start to automatically assign those controls, things like security, things like information or retention policies, things like metadata, and more importantly, how do we classify that HR type information. And lastly, information lifecycle provides us the ability to enforce rules through technology. So by understanding the lifecycle, we can start to apply records management rules using the technology. As it passes through its different stages of its lifecycle, we can use technology to apply the records management controls and thereby reducing a lot of the overhead on us relying on end users to form and make part of those controls as well. Okay, so that's the end of part one of building a scalable records management strategy. The next part of the presentation of this webinar will be delivered on the 20th of March. Please watch out for invitations and check the OBS website for further details. There will also be a survey that will come out immediately after this presentation, so please, I encourage you guys to complete it. And there is a comment section, so I know we have a very wide and dispersed audience, people from different sectors, public, private sector, etc. So really, if there's anything in addition that you would like to see or something that you would like to be made more clear in part 2 of the records management webinar, please place those in the comments and I'll certainly look to address them as best that I can. Before we finish, I just want to have a look. We've got quite a few questions, so if you'll bear with me. Okay, one of the questions that's been asked is really around, is this enterprise records management strategy, can it be applied to any type of SharePoint implementation or at any stage of SharePoint's our implementation lifecycle of SharePoint or implementation approach? Yes, it can, and I think one of the key things is that wherever we're going to change the way we are doing certain things, there's going to be a level of pain that will probably come with it. So where you are down where you're quite far down your SharePoint implementation, particularly in the 2007 platform, and looking to move towards the 2010 platform, I think that this definitely gives us, or it certainly gives you a really good breadth of things that you need to consider. And again, applying that to your implementation doesn't need to, these are all disciplines that don't really reflect at this particular stage a change in the way you are using SharePoint technology, but it certainly will look to change the way some users will work with that type of technology as well. Okay, and another question here was around it would be great to get a sample of a generic business records management taxonomy as a starting point to setting up a records management system. Good question, and the one size fits all is certainly something that I would not propose. I would certainly, there are certain records management taxonomies that are available. If you're in the public sector, you can certainly make use of things like keyword AAA, which is a broad spectrum records classification taxonomy that really aligns to organizations' core business functions. But what I've certainly seen across other areas is that some organizations have tended to, again, move away from those type of classification systems and have a more blended approach where they have a lot more functional based, but again more core business. So every business is the same. You might get similar core functions across things like finance, HR, that sort of things, but you certainly need to have a look at areas of your core business functions and how that relates to you. With that in mind, there certainly are some tools out there that you can use, or some existing classification schemes which you could use. There is one supplier in the market, Data Facet. Data Facets provide what we call, I would say, thesaurus or term sets for SharePoint that really reflect various industries. Some industries like the life sciences industry, government, general business, the construction industry. So you can certainly look to take those types of classification or term thesaurus or taxonomy sets and look to adapt that in your organization. Okay, that seems to be the last of the questions that I've gone through. So again, thank you very much for your time today, ladies and gentlemen, and please have a look at the survey that comes out. There is that comment section. I'm happy to address certain things in the next session. The next session again is really going to be focused around the hands-on how do we take this theoretical structure and implement it into a SharePoint environment. So there we'll be looking particularly at SharePoint's functionality around records management, as well as OVS's document and records management solutions with the i5 software set as well. Thank you very much for your time.